That is, which rests upon freedom, which in its turn ranks under cognitions that are the peculiar product of reason. He who would derive from experience the conceptions of virtue, who would make, as many have really done, that, which at best can but serve as an imperfectly illustrative example, a model for the formation of a perfectly adequate idea on the subject, would in fact transform virtue into a nonentity changeable according to time and circumstance and utterly incapable of being employed as a rule. On the contrary, everyone is conscious that, when anyone is held up to him as a model of virtue, he compares this so-called model with the true original which he possesses in his own mind and values him according to this standard. But this standard is the idea of virtue, in relation to which all possible objects of experience are indeed serviceable as examples, proofs of the practicability in a certain degree of that which the conception of virtue demands, but certainly not as archetypes. That the actions of man will never be in perfect accordance with all the requirements of the pure ideas of reason, does not prove the thought to be chimerical. For only through this idea are all judgments as to moral merit or demerit possible. It consequently lies at the foundation of every approach to moral perfection, however far removed from it the obstacles in human nature, indeterminable as to degree, may keep us. 41. He certainly extended the application of his conception to speculative cognitions also, provided they were given pure and completely a priori, nay, even to mathematics, although this science cannot possess an object otherwhere than in possible experience. I cannot follow him in this, and as little can I follow him in his mystical deduction of these ideas, or in his hypostatization of them. Although, in truth, the elevated and exaggerated language which he employed in describing them is quite capable of an interpretation more subdued and more in accordance with fact and the nature of things. The Platonic Republic has become proverbial as an example, and a striking one, of imaginary perfection, such as can exist only in the brain of the idle thinker. And Brucker ridicules the philosopher for maintaining that a prince can never govern well, unless he is participant in the ideas. But we should do better to follow up this thought and, where this admirable thinker leaves us without assistance, employ new efforts to place it in clearer light, rather than carelessly fling it aside as useless, under the very miserable and pernicious pretext of impracticability. A constitution of the greatest possible human freedom according to laws, by which the liberty of every individual can consist with the liberty of every other, not of the greatest possible happiness, for this follows necessarily from the former, is, to say the least, a necessary idea, which must be placed at the foundation not only of the first plan of the constitution of a state, but of all its laws. And, in this, it not necessary at the outset to take account of the obstacles which lie in our way, obstacles which perhaps do not necessarily arise from the character of human nature, but rather from the previous neglect of true ideas in legislation. For there is nothing more pernicious and more unworthy of the philosopher than the vulgar appeal to a so-called adverse experience, which indeed would not have existed if those institutions had been established at the proper time and in accordance with ideas, while, instead of this, conceptions, crude for the very reason that they have been drawn from experience, have marred and frustrated all our better views and intentions. The more legislation and government are in harmony with this idea, the more rare do punishments become, and thus it is quite reasonable to maintain, as Plato did, that in a perfect state no punishments at all would be necessary. Now although a perfect state may never exist, the idea is not on that account the less just, which holds up this maximum as the archetype or standard of the Constitution, in order to bring legislative government always nearer and nearer to the greatest possible perfection. For at what precise degree human nature must stop in its progress, and how wide must be the chasm which must necessarily exist between the idea and its realization, are problems which no one can or ought to determine, and for this reason, that it is the destination of freedom to overstep all assigned limits between itself and the idea. But not only in that wherein human reason is a real causal agent and where ideas are operative causes of actions and their objects, that is to say, in the region of ethics, but also in regard to nature herself, Plato saw clear proofs of an origin from ideas. A plant and animal, the regular order of nature, probably also the disposition of the whole universe, give manifest evidence that they are possible only by means of and according to ideas. That, indeed, no one creature, under the individual conditions of its existence, perfectly harmonizes with the idea of the most perfect of its kind, just as little as man with the idea of humanity, which nevertheless he bears in his soul as the archetypal standard of his actions. That, notwithstanding, these ideas are in the highest sense individually, unchangeably, and completely determined, and are the original causes of things, and that the totality of connected objects in the universe is alone fully adequate to that idea. Setting aside the exaggerations of expression in the writings of this philosopher, the mental power exhibited in this ascent from the ectypal mode of regarding the physical world to the architectonic connection thereof according to ends, that is, ideas, is an effort which deserves imitation and claims respect. But as regards the principles of ethics, of legislation, and of religion, spheres in which ideas alone render experience possible, although they never attain to full expression therein, he has vindicated for himself a position of peculiar merit, which is not appreciated only because it is judged by the very empirical rules, the validity of which as principles is destroyed by ideas. For as regards nature, experience presents us with rules and is the source of truth, but in relation to ethical laws experience is the parent of illusion, and it is in the highest degree reprehensible to limit or to deduce the laws which dictate what I ought to do, from what is done. We must, however, omit the consideration of these important subjects, the development of which is in reality the peculiar duty and dignity of philosophy, and confine ourselves for the present to the more humble but not less useful task of preparing a firm foundation for those majestic edifices of moral science. For this foundation has been hitherto insecure from the many subterranean passages which reason in its confident but vain search for treasures has made in all directions. Our present duty is to make ourselves perfectly acquainted with the transcendental use made of pure reason, its principles and ideas, that we may be able properly to determine and value its influence and real worth. But before bringing these introductory remarks to a close, I beg those who really have philosophy at heart, and their number is but small, if they shall find themselves convinced by the considerations following as well as by those above, to exert themselves to preserve to the expression idea its original signification, and to take care that it be not lost among those other expressions by which all sorts of representations are loosely designated, that the interests of science may not thereby suffer. We are in no want of words to denominate adequately every mode of representation, without the necessity of encroaching upon terms which are proper to others. The following is a graduated list of them. The genus is representation in general, representatio. Under it stands representation with consciousness, perceptio. A perception which relates solely to the subject as a modification of its state, is a sensation, sensatio. An objective perception is a cognition, cognitio. A cognition is either an intuition or a conception, intuitus vel conceptus. The former has an immediate relation to the object and is singular and individual. The latter has but a mediate relation, by means of a characteristic mark which may be common to several things. A conception is either empirical or pure. A pure conception, in so far as it has its origin in the understanding alone, and is not the conception of a pure sensuous image, is called notio. A conception formed from notions, which transcends the possibility of experience, is an idea or a conception of reason. To one who has accustomed himself to these distinctions, it must be quite intolerable to hear the representation of the color red called an idea. It ought not even to be called a notion or conception of understanding. Section 2. Of Transcendental Ideas. Transcendental analytic showed us how the mere logical form of our cognition can contain the origin of pure conceptions a priori, conceptions which represent objects antecedently to all experience, or rather, indicate the synthetical unity which alone renders possible an empirical cognition of objects. The form of judgments, converted into a conception of the synthesis of intuitions, produced the categories which direct the employment of the understanding and experience. This consideration warrants us to expect that the form of syllogisms, when applied to synthetical unity of intuitions, following the rule of the categories, will contain the origin of particular a priori conceptions, which we may call pure conceptions of reason or transcendental ideas, and which will determine the use of the understanding and the totality of experience according to principles. The function of reason in arguments consists in the universality of the cognition according to conceptions, and the syllogism itself is a judgment which is determined a priori in the whole extent of its condition. The proposition, "Keys is mortal," is one which may be obtained from experience by the aid of the understanding alone. But my wish is to find a conception which contains the condition under which the predicate of this judgment is given. In this case, the conception of man, and after subsuming under this condition, taken in its whole extent, all men are mortal. I determine according to it the cognition of the object thought, and say, Keys is mortal. Hence, in the conclusion of a syllogism we restrict a predicate to a certain object, after having thought it in the major in its whole extent under a certain condition. This complete quantity of the extent in relation to such a condition is called universality, universalitas. To this corresponds totality, universitas, of conditions in the synthesis of intuitions. The transcendental conception of reason is therefore nothing else than the conception of the totality of the conditions of a given condition. Now as the unconditioned alone renders possible totality of conditions, and, conversely, the totality of conditions is itself always unconditioned, a pure rational conception in general can be defined and explained by means of the conception of the unconditioned, in so far as it contains a basis for the synthesis of the conditioned. To the number of modes of relation which the understanding cogitates by means of the categories, the number of pure rational conceptions will correspond. We must therefore seek for, first, an unconditioned of the categorical synthesis in a subject, secondly, of the hypothetical synthesis of the members of a series, thirdly, of the disjunctive synthesis of parts in a system. There are exactly the same number of modes of syllogisms, each of which proceeds through pro-syllogisms to the unconditioned, one to the subject which cannot be employed as predicate, another to the presupposition which supposes nothing higher than itself, and the third to an aggregate of the members of the complete division of the conception. Hence the pure rational conceptions of totality in the synthesis of conditions have a necessary foundation in the nature of human reason, at least as modes of elevating the unity of the understanding to the unconditioned. They may have no valid application, corresponding to their transcendental employment, in concreto, and be thus of no greater utility than to direct the understanding how, while extending them as widely as possible, to maintain its exercise and application in perfect consistence and harmony. But, while speaking here of the totality of conditions and of the unconditioned as the common title of all conceptions of reason, we again light upon an expression which we find it impossible to dispense with, and which nevertheless, owing to the ambiguity attaching to it from long abuse, we cannot employ with safety. The word absolute is one of the few words which, in its original signification, was perfectly adequate to the conception it was intended to convey, a conception which no other word in the same language exactly suits, and the loss, or, which is the same thing, the incautious and loose employment, of which must be followed by the loss of the conception itself. And, as it is a conception which occupies much of the attention of reason, its loss would be greatly to the detriment of all transcendental philosophy. The word absolute is at present frequently used to denote that something can be predicated of a thing considered in itself and intrinsically. In this sense, absolutely possible would signify that which is possible in itself, intern, which is, in fact, the least that one can predicate of an object. On the other hand, it is sometimes employed to indicate that a thing is valid in all respects, for example, absolute sovereignty. Absolutely possible would in this sense signify that which is possible in all relations and in every respect, and this is the most that can be predicated of the possibility of a thing. Now these significations do in truth frequently coincide. Thus, for example, that which is intrinsically impossible is also impossible in all relations, that is, absolutely impossible. But in most cases they differ from each other toto kalo, and I can by no means conclude that, because a thing is in itself possible, it is also possible in all relations, and therefore absolutely. Nay, more, I shall in the sequel show that absolute necessity does not by any means depend on internal necessity, and that, therefore, it must not be considered as synonymous with it. Of an opposite which is intrinsically impossible, we may affirm that it is in all respects impossible, and that, consequently, the thing itself, of which this is the opposite, is absolutely necessary. But I cannot reason conversely and say, the opposite of that which is absolutely necessary is intrinsically impossible, that is, that the absolute necessity of things is an internal necessity. For this internal necessity is in certain cases a mere empty word with which the least conception cannot be connected, while the conception of the necessity of a thing in all relations possesses very peculiar determinations. Now as the loss of a conception of great utility in speculative science cannot be a matter of indifference to the philosopher, I trust that the proper determination and careful preservation of the expression on which the conception depends will likewise be not indifferent to him. In this enlarged signification, then, shall I employ the word absolute, in opposition to that which is valid only in some particular respect, for the latter is restricted by conditions, the former is valid without any restriction whatever. Now the transcendental conception of reason has for its object nothing else than absolute totality in the synthesis of conditions and does not rest satisfied till it has attained to the absolutely, that is, in all respects and relations, unconditioned. For pure reason leaves to the understanding everything that immediately relates to the object of intuition or rather to their synthesis in imagination. The former restricts itself to the absolute totality in the employment of the conceptions of the understanding and aims at carrying out the synthetical unity which is cogitated in the category, even to the unconditioned. This unity may hence be called the rational unity of phenomena, as the other, which the category expresses, may be termed the unity of the understanding. Reason, therefore, has an immediate relation to the use of the understanding, not indeed in so far as the latter contains the ground of possible experience, for the conception of the absolute totality of conditions is not a conception that can be employed in experience, because no experience is unconditioned, but solely for the purpose of directing it to a certain unity, of which the understanding has no conception, and the aim of which is to collect into an absolute whole all acts of the understanding. Hence the objective employment of the pure conceptions of reason is always transcendent, while that of the pure conceptions of the understanding must, according to their nature, be always immanent, inasmuch as they are limited to possible experience. I understand by idea a necessary conception of reason, to which no corresponding object can be discovered in the world of sense. Accordingly, the pure conceptions of reason at present under consideration are transcendental ideas. They are conceptions of pure reason, for they regard all empirical cognition as determined by means of an absolute totality of conditions. They are not mere fictions, but natural and necessary products of reason, and have hence a necessary relation to the whole sphere of the exercise of the understanding. And, finally, they are transcendent, and overstep the limits of all experiences, in which, consequently, no object can ever be presented that would be perfectly adequate to a transcendental idea. When we use the word idea, we say, as regards its object, an object of the pure understanding, a great deal, but as regards its subject, that is, in respect of its reality under conditions of experience, exceedingly little, because the idea, as the conception of a maximum, can never be completely and adequately presented in concreto. Now, as in the merely speculative employment of reason the latter is properly the sole aim, and as in this case the approximation to a conception, which is never attained in practice, is the same thing as if the conception were non-existent, it is commonly said of the conception of this kind, it is only an idea. So we might very well say, the absolute totality of all phenomena is only an idea, for, as we never can present an adequate representation of it, it remains for us a problem incapable of solution. On the other hand, as in the practical use of the understanding we have only to do with action and practice according to rules, an idea of pure reason can always be given really in concreto, although only partially, nay, it is the indispensable condition of all practical employment of reason. The practice or execution of the idea is always limited and defective, but nevertheless within indeterminable boundaries, consequently always under the influence of the conception of an absolute perfection. And thus the practical idea is always in the highest degree fruitful, and in relation to real actions indispensably necessary. In the idea, pure reason possesses even causality and the power of producing that which its conception contains. Hence we cannot say of wisdom, in a disparaging way, it is only an idea. For the very reason that it is the idea of the necessary unity of all possible aims, it must be for all practical exertions and endeavors the primitive condition and rule, a rule which, if not constitutive, is at least limitative. Now, although we must say of the transcendental conceptions of reason, they are only ideas, we must not, on this account, look upon them as superfluous and nugatory. For, although no object can be determined by them, they can be of great utility, unobserved and at the basis of the edifice of the understanding, as the canon for its extended and self-consistent exercise. A canon which, indeed, does not enable it to cognize more in an object than it would cognize by the help of its own conceptions, but which guides it more securely in its cognition. Not to mention that they perhaps render possible a transition from our conceptions of nature and the non-ego to the practical conceptions, and thus produce for even ethical ideas keeping, so to speak, and connection with the speculative cognitions of reason. The explication of all this must be looked for in the sequel. But setting aside, in conformity with our original purpose, the consideration of the practical ideas, we proceed to contemplate reason in its speculative use alone, nay, in a still more restricted sphere, to wit, in the transcendental use. And here must strike into the same path which we followed in our deduction of the categories. That is to say, we shall consider the logical form of the cognition of reason, that we may see whether reason may not be thereby a source of conceptions which enables us to regard objects in themselves as determined synthetically a priori, in relation to one or other of the functions of reason. Reason, considered as the faculty of a certain logical form of cognition, is the faculty of conclusion, that is, of mediate judgment, by means of the subsumption of the condition of a possible judgment under the condition of a given judgment. The given judgment is the general rule, major. The subsumption of the condition of another possible judgment under the condition of the rule is the minor. The actual judgment, which announces the assertion of the rule in the subsumed case, is the conclusion, conclusio. The rule predicates something generally under a certain condition. The condition of the rule is satisfied in some particular case. It follows that what was valid in general under that condition must also be considered as valid in the particular case which satisfies this condition. It is very plain that reason attains to a cognition, by means of acts of the understanding which constitute a series of conditions. When I arrive at the proposition, all bodies are changeable, by beginning with the more remote cognition, in which the conception of body does not appear, but which nevertheless contains the condition of that conception, all compound is changeable, by proceeding from this to a less remote cognition, which stands under the condition of the former, bodies are compound, and hence to a third, which at length connects for me the remote cognition changeable, with the one before me, consequently, bodies are changeable, I have arrived at a cognition conclusion, through a series of conditions premises. Now every series, whose exponent, of the categorical or hypothetical judgment, is given, can be continued. Consequently the same procedure of reason conducts us to the ratiocinatio polysyllogistica, which is a series of syllogisms, that can be continued either on the side of the conditions, per prosyllogismos, or of the conditioned, per episyllogismos, to an indefinite extent. But we very soon perceive that the chain or series of prosyllogisms, that is, of deduced cognitions on the side of the grounds or conditions of a given cognition, in other words, the ascending series of syllogisms must have a very different relation to the faculty of reason from that of the descending series, that is, the progressive procedure of reason on the side of the condition by means of episyllogisms. For, as in the former case the cognition, conclusio, is given only as conditioned, reason can attain to this cognition only under the presupposition that all the members of the series on the side of the conditions are given, totality in the series of premises, because only under this supposition is the judgment we may be considering possible a priori, while on the side of the condition or the inferences, only an incomplete and becoming, and not a presupposed or given series, consequently only a potential progression, is cogitated. Hence, when a cognition is contemplated as conditioned, reason is compelled to consider the series of conditions in an ascending line as completed and given in their totality. But if the very same condition is considered at the same time as the condition of other cognitions, which together constitute a series of inferences or consequences in a descending line, reason may preserve a perfect indifference as to how far this progression may extend a parti posteriori, and whether the totality of this series is possible, because it stands in no need of such a series for the purpose of arriving at the conclusion before it, inasmuch as this conclusion is sufficiently guaranteed and determined on grounds of parti priori. It may be the case that upon the side of the conditions the series of premises has a first or highest condition, or it may not possess this, and so be a parti priori unlimited, but it must, nevertheless, contain totality of conditions, even admitting that we never could succeed in completely apprehending it, and the whole series must be unconditionally true, if the conditioned, which is considered as an inference resulting from it, is to be held as true. This is a requirement of reason, which announces its cognition as determined a priori and as necessary, either in itself, and in this case it needs no grounds to rest upon, or, if it is deduced, as a member of a series of grounds, which is itself unconditionally true. Section 3. System of Transcendental Ideas. We are not at present engaged with a logical dialectic, which makes complete abstraction of the content of cognition and aims only at unveiling the illusory appearance in the form of syllogisms. Our subject is transcendental dialectic, which must contain, completely a priori, the origin of certain cognitions drawn from pure reason, and the origin of certain deduced conceptions, the object of which cannot be given empirically and which therefore lay beyond the sphere of the faculty of understanding. We have observed, from the natural relation which the transcendental use of our cognition, in syllogisms as well as in judgments, must have to the logical, that there are three kinds of dialectical arguments, corresponding to the three modes of conclusion, by which reason attains to cognitions on principles, and that in all it is the business of reason to ascend from the conditioned synthesis, beyond which the understanding never proceeds, to the unconditioned which the understanding never can reach. Now the most general relations which can exist in our representations are: first, the relation to the subject; second, the relation to objects, either as phenomena, or as objects of thought in general. If we connect this subdivision with the main division, all the relations of our representations, of which we can form either a conception or an idea, are threefold. 1. The relation to the subject. 2. The relation to the manifold of the object as a phenomenon. 3. The relation to all things in general. Now all pure conceptions have to do in general with the synthetical unity of representations, conceptions of pure reason, transcendental ideas, on the other hand, with the unconditional synthetical unity of all conditions. It follows that all transcendental ideas arrange themselves in three classes, the first of which contains the absolute, unconditioned, unity of the thinking subject, the second the absolute unity of the series of the conditions of a phenomenon, the third the absolute unity of the condition of all objects of thought in general. The thinking subject is the object matter of psychology. The sum total of all phenomena, the world, is the object matter of cosmology, and the thing which contains the highest condition of the possibility of all that is cogitable, the being of all beings, is the object matter of all theology. Thus pure reason presents us with the idea of a transcendental doctrine of the soul, psychologia rationalis, of a transcendental science of the world, cosmologia rationalis, and finally of a transcendental doctrine of God, theologia transcendentalis. Understanding cannot originate even the outline of any of these sciences, even when connected with the highest logical use of reason, that is, all cogitable syllogisms, for the purpose of proceeding from one object, phenomenon, to all others, even to the utmost limits of the empirical synthesis. They are, on the contrary, pure and genuine products, or problems, of pure reason. What modi of the pure conceptions of reason these transcendental ideas are will be fully exposed in the following chapter. They follow the guiding thread of the categories. For pure reason never relates immediately to objects, but to the conceptions of these contained in the understanding. In like manner, it will be made manifest in the detailed explanation of these ideas, how reason, merely through the synthetical use of the same function which it employs in a categorical syllogism, necessarily attains to the conception of the absolute unity of the thinking subject. How the logical procedure in hypothetical ideas necessarily produces the idea of the absolutely unconditioned in a series of given conditions, and finally, how the mere form of the disjunctive syllogism involves the highest conception of a being of all beings, a thought which at first sight seems in the highest degree paradoxical. An objective deduction, such as we were able to present in the case of the categories, is impossible as regards these transcendental ideas. For they have, in truth, no relation to any object in experience, for the very reason that they are only ideas. But a subjective deduction of them from the nature of our reason is possible, and has been given in the present chapter. It is easy to perceive that the sole aim of pure reason is the absolute totality of the synthesis on the side of the conditions, and that it does not concern itself with the absolute completeness on the part of the conditioned. For of the former alone does she stand in need, in order to proposit the whole series of conditions, and thus present them to the understanding a priori. But if we once have a completely, and unconditionally, given condition, there is no further necessity, in proceeding with the series, for a conception of reason, for the understanding takes of itself every step downward, from the condition to the conditioned. Thus the transcendental ideas are available only for ascending in the series of conditions, till we reach the unconditioned, that is, principles. As regards descending to the conditioned, on the other hand, we find that there is a widely extensive logical use which reason makes of the laws of the understanding, but that a transcendental use thereof is impossible, and that when we form an idea of the absolute totality of such a synthesis, for example, of the whole series of all future changes in the world, this idea is a mere ens rationis, an arbitrary fiction of thought, and not a necessary presupposition of reason. For the possibility of the condition presupposes the totality of its conditions, but not of its consequences. Consequently, this conception is not a transcendental idea, and it is with these alone that we are at present occupied. Finally, it is obvious that there exists among the transcendental ideas a certain connection and unity, and that pure reason, by means of them, collects all its cognitions into one system. From the cognition of self to the cognition of the world, and through these to the Supreme Being, the progression is so natural, that it seems to resemble the logical march of reason from the premises to the conclusion. Now whether there lies unobserved at the foundation of these ideas an analogy of the same kind as exists between the logical and transcendental procedure of reason, is another of those questions, the answer to which we must not expect till we arrive at a more advanced stage in our inquiries. In this cursory and preliminary view, we have, meanwhile, reached our aim. For we have dispelled the ambiguity which attached to the transcendental conceptions of reason, from their being commonly mixed up with other conceptions in the systems of philosophers, and not properly distinguished from the conceptions of the understanding. We have exposed their origin and, thereby, at the same time their determinate number, and presented them in a systematic connection, and have thus marked out and enclosed a definite sphere for pure reason. 42. The science of metaphysics has for the proper object of its inquiries only three grand ideas: God, freedom, and immortality, and it aims at showing that the second conception, conjoined with the first, must lead to the third, as a necessary conclusion. All the other subjects with which it occupies itself are merely means for the attainment and realization of these ideas. It does not require these ideas for the construction of a science of nature, but, on the contrary, for the purpose of passing beyond the sphere of nature. A complete insight into and comprehension of them would render theology, ethics, and, through the conjunction of both, religion, solely dependent on the speculative faculty of reason. In a systematic representation of these ideas, the above-mentioned arrangement, the synthetical one, would be the most suitable, but in the investigation which must necessarily precede it, the analytical, which reverses this arrangement, would be better adapted to our purpose, as in it we should proceed from that which experience immediately presents to us, psychology, to cosmology, and thence to theology. Transcendental Dialectic, Book 2, of the Dialectical Procedure of Pure Reason. It may be said that the object of a merely transcendental idea is something of which we have no conception, although the idea may be a necessary product of reason according to its original laws. For, in fact, a conception of an object that is adequate to the idea given by reason is impossible. For such an object must be capable of being presented and intuited in a possible experience. But we should express our meaning better, and with less risk of being misunderstood, if we said that we can have no knowledge of an object, which perfectly corresponds to an idea, although we may possess a problematical conception thereof. Now the transcendental, subjective, reality at least of the pure conceptions of reason rests upon the fact that we are led to such ideas by a necessary procedure of reason. There must therefore be syllogisms which contain no empirical premises, and by means of which we conclude from something that we do know, to something of which we do not even possess a conception, to which we, nevertheless, by an unavoidable illusion, ascribe objective reality. Such arguments are, as regards their result, rather to be termed sophisms than syllogisms, although indeed, as regards their origin, they are very well entitled to the latter name, inasmuch as they are not fictions or accidental products of reason, but are necessitated by its very nature. They are sophisms, not of men but of pure reason herself, from which the wisest cannot free himself. After long labor he may be able to guard against the error, but he can never be thoroughly rid of the illusion which continually mocks and misleads him. Of these dialectical arguments there are three kinds, corresponding to the number of the ideas which their conclusions present. In the argument or syllogism of the first class, I conclude, from the transcendental conception of the subject contains no manifold, the absolute unity of the subject itself, of which I cannot in this manner attain to a conception. This dialectical argument I shall call the transcendental paralogism. The second class of sophistical arguments is occupied with the transcendental conception of the absolute totality of the series of conditions for a given phenomenon, and I conclude, from the fact that I have always a self-contradictory conception of the unconditioned synthetical unity of the series upon one side, the truth of the opposite unity, of which I have nevertheless no conception. The condition of reason in these dialectical arguments, I shall term the antinomy of pure reason. Finally, according to the third kind of sophistical argument, I conclude, from the totality of the conditions of thinking objects in general, in so far as they can be given, the absolute synthetical unity of all conditions of the possibility of things in general. That is, from things which I do not know in their mere transcendental conception, I conclude a being of all beings which I know still less by means of a transcendental conception, and of whose unconditioned necessity I can form no conception whatever. This dialectical argument I shall call the ideal of pure reason. Chapter 1 of the Paralogisms of Pure Reason. The logical paralogism consists in the falsity of an argument in respect of its form, be the content what it may. But a transcendental paralogism has a transcendental foundation, and concludes falsely, while the form is correct and unexceptionable. In this manner the paralogism has its foundation in the nature of human reason, and is the parent of an unavoidable, though not insoluble, mental illusion. We now come to a conception which was not inserted in the general list of transcendental conceptions, and yet must be reckoned with them, but at the same time without in the least altering, or indicating a deficiency in that table. This is the conception, or, if the term is preferred, the judgment, I think. But it is readily perceived that this thought is as it were the vehicle of all conceptions in general, and consequently of transcendental conceptions also, and that it is therefore regarded as a transcendental conception, although it can have no peculiar claim to be so ranked, inasmuch as its only use is to indicate that all thought is accompanied by consciousness. At the same time, pure as this conception is from empirical content, impressions of the senses, it enables us to distinguish two different kinds of objects. I, as thinking, am an object of the internal sense and am called soul. That which is an object of the external senses is called body. Thus the expression, I, as a thinking being, designates the object matter of psychology, which may be called the rational doctrine of the soul, and as much as in this science I desire to know nothing of the soul but what, independently of all experience which determines me in concreto, may be concluded from this conception, I, in so far as it appears in all thought. Now, the rational doctrine of the soul is really an undertaking of this kind. For if the smallest empirical element of thought, if any particular perception of my internal state, were to be introduced among the grounds of cognition of this science, it would not be a rational, but an empirical doctrine of the soul. We have thus before us a pretended science, raised upon the single proposition, I think, whose foundation or want of foundation we may very properly, and agreeably with the nature of a transcendental philosophy, here examine. It ought not to be objected that in this proposition, which expresses the perception of one's self, an internal experience is asserted, and that consequently the rational doctrine of the soul which is founded upon it, is not pure, but partly founded upon an empirical principle. For this internal perception is nothing more than the mere apperception, I think, which in fact renders all transcendental conceptions possible, in which we say, I think substance, cause, etc. For internal experience in general and its possibility, or perception in general, and its relation to other perceptions, unless some particular distinction or determination thereof is empirically given, cannot be regarded as empirical cognition, but as cognition of the empirical, and belongs to the investigation of the possibility of every experience, which is certainly transcendental. The smallest object of experience, for example, only pleasure or pain, that should be included in the general representation of self-consciousness, would immediately change the rational into an empirical psychology. I think, is therefore the only text of rational psychology, from which it must develop its whole system. It is manifest that this thought, when applied to an object, myself, can contain nothing but transcendental predicates thereof, because the least empirical predicate would destroy the purity of the science and its independence of all experience. But we shall have to follow here the guidance of the categories. Only as in the present case a thing, I, as thinking being, is at first given, we shall not indeed change the order of the categories as it stands in the table, but begin at the category of substance, by which the thing in itself is represented and proceeds backwards through the series. The topic of the rational doctrine of the soul, from which everything else it may contain must be deduced, is accordingly as follows. The topic of the rational doctrine of the soul, from which everything else it may contain must be deduced, is accordingly as follows. 1. 2. The soul is substance. As regards its quality, it is simple. 3. As regards the different times in which it exists, it is numerically identical. That is unity, not plurality. 4. It is in relation to possible objects in space. 43. The reader, who may not so easily perceive the psychological sense of these expressions, taken here in their transcendental abstraction, and cannot guess why the latter attribute of the soul belongs to the category of existence, will find the expressions sufficiently explained and justified in the sequel. I have, moreover, to apologize for the Latin terms which have been employed, instead of their German synonyms, contrary to the rules of correct writing. But I judged it better to sacrifice elegance to perspicuity. From these elements originate all the conceptions of pure psychology, by combination alone, without the aid of any other principle. This substance, merely as an object of the internal sense, gives the conception of immateriality, as simple substance, that of incorruptibility, its identity, as intellectual substance, gives the conception of personality, all these three together, spirituality. Its relation to objects in space gives us the conception of connection, commercium, with bodies. Thus it represents thinking substance as the principle of life in matter, that is, as a soul, anima, and as the ground of animality, and this, limited and determined by the conception of spirituality, gives us that of immortality. Now to these conceptions relate four paralogisms of a transcendental psychology, which is falsely held to be a science of pure reason, touching the nature of our thinking being. We can, however, lay at the foundation of this science nothing but the simple and in itself perfectly contentless representation, I, which cannot even be called a conception, but merely a consciousness which accompanies all conceptions. By this, I, or he, or it, who or which thinks, nothing more is represented than a transcendental subject of thought equals X, which is cognized only by means of the thoughts that are its predicates, and of which, apart from these, we cannot form the least conception. Hence in a perpetual circle, inasmuch as we must always employ it, in order to frame any judgment respecting it. And this inconvenience we find it impossible to rid ourselves of, because consciousness in itself is not so much a representation distinguishing a particular object, as a form of representation in general, insofar as it may be termed cognition. For in and by cognition alone do I think anything.
It must, however, appear extraordinary at first sight that the condition under which I think, and which is consequently a property of my subject, should be held to be likewise valid for every existence which thinks, and that we can presume to base upon a seemingly empirical proposition a judgment which is apodictic and universal, to wit, that everything which thinks is constituted as the voice of my consciousness declares it to be, that is, as a self-conscious being.
The cause of this belief is to be found in the fact that we necessarily attribute to things a priori all the properties which constitute conditions under which alone we can cogitate them. Now I cannot obtain the least representation of a thinking being by means of external experience, but solely through self-consciousness. Such objects are consequently nothing more than the transference of this consciousness of mine to other things which can only thus be represented as thinking beings.
The proposition, I think, is, in the present case, understood in a problematical sense, not in so far as it contains a perception of an existence like the Cartesian, cogito, ergo sum, but in regard to its mere possibility, for the purpose of discovering what properties may be inferred from so simple a proposition and predicated of the subject of it. If at the foundation of our pure rational cognition of thinking beings there lay more than the mere cogito, if we could likewise call in aid observations on the play of our thoughts, and the thence derived natural laws of the thinking self, there would arise an empirical psychology which would be a kind of physiology of the internal sense and might possibly be capable of explaining the phenomena of that sense. But it could never be available for discovering those properties which do not belong to possible experience, such as the quality of simplicity, nor could it make any apodictic enunciation on the nature of thinking beings. It would therefore not be a rational psychology. Now, as the proposition, I think, in the problematical sense, contains the form of every judgment in general and as the constant accompaniment of all the categories, it is manifest that conclusions are drawn from it only by a transcendental employment of the understanding.
This use of the understanding excludes all empirical elements, and we cannot, as has been shown above, have any favorable conception beforehand of its procedure. We shall therefore follow with a critical eye this proposition through all the predicaments of pure psychology, but we shall, for brevity's sake, allow this examination to proceed in an uninterrupted connection. Before entering on this task, however, the following general remark may help to quicken our attention to this mode of argument. It is not merely through my thinking that I cognize an object, but only through my determining a given intuition in relation to the unity of consciousness in which all thinking consists. It follows that I cognize myself, not through my being conscious of myself as thinking, but only when I am conscious of the intuition of myself as determined in relation to the function of thought.
All the modi of self-consciousness in thought are hence not conceptions of objects, conceptions of the understanding. Categories, they are mere logical functions, which do not present to thought an object to be cognized, and cannot therefore present myself as an object. Not the consciousness of the determining, but only that of the determinable self, that is, of my internal intuition, in so far as the manifold contained in it can be connected conformably with the general condition of the unity of apperception in thought, is the object.
1. In all judgments I am the determining subject of that relation which constitutes a judgment.
But that the I which thinks, must be considered as in thought always a subject, and as a thing which cannot be a predicate to thought, is an apodictic and identical proposition.
But this proposition does not signify that I, as an object, am, for myself, a self-subsistent being or substance. This latter statement, an ambitious one, requires to be supported by data which are not to be discovered in thought, and are perhaps, in so far as I consider the thinking self merely as such, not to be discovered in the thinking self at all. 2.
That the I or ego of apperception, and consequently in all thought, is singular or simple, and cannot be resolved into a plurality of subjects, and therefore indicates a logically simple subject. This is self-evident from the very conception of an ego, and is consequently an analytical proposition.
But this is not tantamount to declaring that the thinking ego is a simple substance, for this would be a synthetical proposition.
The conception of substance always relates to intuitions, which with me cannot be other than sensuous, and which consequently lie completely out of the sphere of the understanding and its thought. But to this sphere belongs the affirmation that the ego is simple in thought. It would indeed be surprising, if the conception of substance, which in other cases requires so much labor to distinguish from the other elements presented by intuition, so much trouble, too, to discover whether it can be simple, as in the case of the parts of matter, should be presented immediately to me, as if by revelation, in the poorest mental representation of all.
3. The proposition of the identity of myself amidst all the manifold representations of which I am conscious, is likewise a proposition lying in the conceptions themselves, and is consequently analytical.
But this identity of the subject, of which I am conscious in all its representations, does not relate to or concern the intuition of the subject, by which it is given as an object.
This proposition cannot therefore enounce the identity of the person, by which is understood the consciousness of the identity of its own substance as a thinking being in all change and variation of circumstances. To prove this, we should require not a mere analysis of the proposition, but synthetical judgments based upon a given intuition. 4. I distinguish my own existence, as that of a thinking being, from that of other things external to me, among which my body also is reckoned. This is also an analytical proposition, for other things are exactly those which I think as different or distinguished from myself. But whether this consciousness of myself is possible without things external to me, and whether therefore I can exist merely as a thinking being, without being man, cannot be known or inferred from this proposition. Thus we have gained nothing as regards the cognition of myself as object, by the analysis of the consciousness of myself in thought. The logical exposition of thought in general is mistaken for a metaphysical determination of the object.
Our critique would be an investigation utterly superfluous, if there existed a possibility of proving a priori that all thinking beings are in themselves simple substances, as such, therefore, possess the inseparable attribute of personality, and are conscious of their existence apart from and unconnected with matter. For we should thus have taken a step beyond the world of sense, and have penetrated into the sphere of noumena, and in this case the right could not be denied us of extending our knowledge in this sphere, of establishing Orselvasand, under a favoring star, appropriating to ourselves possessions in it.
For the proposition, every thinking being, as such, is simple substance, is an a priori synthetical proposition, because in the first place it goes beyond the conception which is the subject of it, and adds to the mere notion of a thinking being the mode of its existence, and in the second place annesses a predicate, that of simplicity, to the latter conception, a predicate which it could not have discovered in the sphere of experience. It would follow that a priori synthetical propositions are possible and legitimate, not only, as we have maintained, in relation to objects of possible experience, and as principles of the possibility of this experience itself, but are applicable to things in themselves, an inference which makes an end of the whole of this critique, and obliges us to fall back on the old mode of metaphysical procedure. But indeed the danger is not so great, if we look a little closer into the question. There lurks in the procedure of rational psychology a paralogism, which is represented in the following syllogism. That which cannot be cogitated otherwise than as subject, does not exist otherwise than as subject, and is therefore substance. A thinking being, considered merely as such, cannot be cogitated otherwise than as subject. Therefore it exists also as such, that is, as substance. In the major we speak of a being that can be cogitated generally and in every relation, consequently as it may be given in intuition. But in the minor we speak of the same being only in so far as it regards itself as subject, relatively to thought and the unity of consciousness, but not in relation to intuition, by which it is presented as an object to thought. Thus the conclusion is here arrived at by a sophisma figurae dictionis. 44. Thought is taken in the two premises in two totally different senses. In the major it is considered as relating and applying to objects in general, consequently to objects of intuition also. In the minor, we understand it as relating merely to self-consciousness. In this sense, we do not cogitate an object, but merely the relation to the self-consciousness of the subject, as the form of thought. In the former premise we speak of things which cannot be cogitated otherwise than as subjects. In the second, we do not speak of things, but of thought, all objects being abstracted, in which the ego is always the subject of consciousness. Hence the conclusion cannot be, I cannot exist otherwise than as subject, but only, I can, in cogitating my existence, employ my ego only as the subject of the judgment. But this is an identical proposition, and throws no light on the mode of my existence. That this famous argument is a mere paralogism, will be plain to anyone who will consider the general remark which precedes our exposition of the principles of the pure understanding, and the section on noumena. For it was there proved that the conception of a thing, which can exist per se, only as a subject and never as a predicate, possesses no objective reality. That is to say, we can never know whether there exists any object to correspond to the conception. Consequently, the conception is nothing more than a conception, and from it we derive no proper knowledge. If this conception is to indicate by the term substance, an object that can be given, if it is to become a cognition, we must have at the foundation of the cognition a permanent intuition, as the indispensable condition of its objective reality. For through intuition alone can an object be given. But in internal intuition there is nothing permanent, for the ego is but the consciousness of my thought. If then, we appeal merely to thought, we cannot discover the necessary condition of the application of the conception of substance, that is, of a subject existing per se, to the subject as a thinking being. And thus the conception of the simple nature of substance, which is connected with the objective reality of this conception, is shown to be also invalid, and to be, in fact, nothing more than the logical qualitative unity of self-consciousness in thought, whilst we remain perfectly ignorant whether the subject is composite or not. Refutation of the argument of Mendelssohn for the substantiality or permanence of the soul. This acute philosopher easily perceived the insufficiency of the common argument which attempts to prove that the soul, it being granted that it is a simple being, cannot perish by dissolution or decomposition, he saw it as not impossible for it to cease to be by extinction or disappearance. He endeavored to prove in his Phaedo that the soul cannot be annihilated by showing that a simple being cannot cease to exist. Inasmuch as, he said, a simple existence cannot diminish, nor gradually lose portions of its being, and thus be by degrees reduced to nothing, for it possesses no parts, and therefore no multiplicity, between the moment in which it is, and the moment in which it is not, no time can be discovered, which is impossible. But this philosopher did not consider that, granting the soul to possess this simple nature, which contains no parts external to each other and consequently no extensive quantity, we cannot refuse to it any less than to any other being, intensive quantity, fatus, a degree of reality in regard to all its faculties, nay, to all that constitutes its existence. But this degree of reality can become less and less through an infinite series of smaller degrees. It follows, therefore, that this supposed substance, this thing, the permanence of which is not assured in any other way, may, if not by decomposition, by gradual loss, remissio, of its powers, consequently by languescence, if I may employ this expression, be changed into nothing. For consciousness itself has always a degree, which may be lessened. Consequently the faculty of being conscious may be diminished, and so with all other faculties. The permanence of the soul, therefore, as an object of the internal sense, remains undemonstrated, nay, even indemonstrable. Its permanence in life is evident, per se, inasmuch as the thinking being, as man, is to itself, at the same time, an object of the external senses. But this does not authorize the rational psychologist to affirm, from mere conceptions, its permanence beyond life. 45. Clearness is not, as logicians maintain, the consciousness of a representation. For a certain degree of consciousness, which may not, however, be sufficient for recollection, is to be met with in many dim representations.
For without any consciousness at all, we should not be able to recognize any difference in the obscure representations we connect, as we really can do with many conceptions, such as those of right and justice, and those of the musician, who strikes at once several notes in improvising a piece of music.
But a representation is clear, in which our consciousness is sufficient for the consciousness of the difference of this representation from others.
If we are only conscious that there is a difference, but are not conscious of the difference, that is, what the difference is, the representation must be termed obscure.
There is, consequently, an infinite series of degrees of consciousness down to its entire disappearance.
46. There are some who think they have done enough to establish a new possibility in the mode of the existence of souls, when they have shown that there is no contradiction in their hypotheses on this subject.
Such are those who affirm the possibility of thought, of which they have no other knowledge than what they derive from its use in connecting empirical intuitions presented in this our human life, after this life has ceased. But it is very easy to embarrass them by the introduction of counter-possibilities, which rest upon quite as good a foundation. Such, for example, is the possibility of the division of a simple substance into several substances, and conversely, of the coalition of several into one simple substance. For, although divisibility presupposes composition, it does not necessarily require a composition of substances, but only of the degrees, of the several faculties, of one and the same substance. Now we can cogitate all the powers and faculties of the soul, even that of consciousness, as diminished by one half, the substance still remaining. In the same way we can represent to ourselves without contradiction, this obliterated half is preserved, not in the soul, but without it, and we can believe that, as in this case everything that is real in the soul, and has a degree, consequently its entire existence, has been halved, a particular substance would arise out of the soul. For the multiplicity, which has been divided, formerly existed, but not as a multiplicity of substances, but of every reality as the quantum of existence in it. And the unity of substance was merely a mode of existence, which by this division alone has been transformed into a plurality of subsistence. In the same manner several simple substances might coalesce into one, without anything being lost except the plurality of subsistence, inasmuch as the one substance would contain the degree of reality of all the former substances. Perhaps, indeed, the simple substances, which appear under the form of matter, might, not indeed by a mechanical or chemical influence upon each other, but by an unknown influence, of which the former would be but the phenomenal appearance, by means of such a dynamical division of the parent souls, as intensive quantities, produce other souls, while the former repaired the loss thus sustained with new matter of the same sort. I am far from allowing any value to such chimeras, and the principles of our analytic have clearly proved that no other than an empirical use of the categories, that of substance, for example, is possible. But if the rationalist is bold enough to construct, on the mere authority of the faculty of thought, without any intuition, whereby an object is given, a self-subsistent being, merely because the unity of apperception in thought cannot allow him to believe it a composite being, instead of declaring, as he ought to do, that he is unable to explain the possibility of the thinking nature, what ought to hinder the materialist, with as complete an independence of experience, to employ the principle of the rationalist in a directly opposite man? But if the rationalist is bold enough to construct, on the mere authority of the faculty of thought, without any intuition, whereby an object is given, a self-subsistent being, merely because the unity of apperception in thought cannot allow him to believe it a composite being, instead of declaring, as he ought to do, that he is unable to explain the possibility of a thinking nature. What ought to hinder the materialist, with his complete independence of experience, to employ the principle of the rationalist in a directly opposite manner, still preserving the formal unity required by his opponent?
Intuition, whereby an object is given, a self-subsistent being, merely because the unity of apperception in thought cannot allow him to believe it a composite being, instead of declaring, as he ought to do, that he is unable to explain the possibility of a thinking nature. What ought to hinder the materialist, with his complete and independence of experience, to employ the principle of the rationalist in a directly opposite manner, still preserving the formal unity required by his opponent? If, now, we take the above propositions, as they must be accepted as valid for all thinking beings in the system of rational psychology, in synthetical connection, and proceed, from the category of relation, with the proposition, all thinking beings are, as such, substances, backwards through the series, till the circle is completed, we come at last to their existence, of which, in this system of rational psychology, substances are held to be conscious, independently of external things. Nay, it is asserted that, in relation to the permanence which is a necessary characteristic of substance, they can of themselves determine external things.
It follows that idealism, at least problematical idealism, is perfectly unavoidable in this rationalistic system. And, if the existence of outward things is not held to be requisite to the determination of the existence of a substance in time, the existence of these outward things at all is a gratuitous assumption which remains without the possibility of a proof. But if we proceed analytically, the I think, as a proposition containing in itself an existence is given, consequently modality being the principle, and dissect this proposition, in order to ascertain its content, and discover whether and how this ego determines its existence in time and space without the aid of anything external. The propositions of rationalistic psychology would not begin with the conception of a thinking being, but with a reality, and the properties of a thinking being in general would be deduced from the mode in which this reality is cogitated, after everything empirical had been abstracted, as is shown in the following table. 1. I think. 2. 3. As subject, as simple subject. 4. As identical subject, in every state of my thought.
Now, inasmuch as it is not determined in this second proposition, whether I can exist and be cogitated only as subject, and not also as a predicate of another being, the conception of a subject is here taken in a merely logical sense, and it remains undetermined, whether substance is to be cogitated under the conception or not. But in the third proposition, the absolute unity of apperception, the simple ego in the representation to which all connection and separation, which constitute thought, relate, is of itself important, even although it presents us with no information about the constitution or subsistence of the subject.
Apperception is something real, and the simplicity of its nature is given in the very fact of its possibility. Now in space there is nothing real that is at the same time simple, for points, which are the only simple things in space, are merely limits, but not constituent parts of space. From this follows the impossibility of a definition on the basis of materialism of the constitution of my ego as a merely thinking subject.
But, because my existence is considered in the first proposition as given, for it does not mean, every thinking being exists, for this would be predicating of them absolute necessity, but only, I exist thinking, the proposition is quite empirical, and contains the determinability of my existence merely in relation to my representations in time. But as I require for this purpose something that is permanent, such as is not given in internal intuition, the mode of my existence, whether as substance or as accident, cannot be determined by means of this simple self-consciousness. Thus, if materialism is inadequate to explain the mode in which I exist, spiritualism is likewise as insufficient, and the conclusion is that we are utterly unable to attain to any knowledge of the constitution of the soul, insofar as relates to the possibility of its existence apart from external objects.
And, indeed, how should it be possible, merely by the aid of the unity of consciousness, which we cognize only for the reason that it is indispensable to the possibility of experience, to pass the bounds of experience, our existence in this life, and to extend our cognition to the nature of all thinking beings by means of the empirical, but in relation to every sort of intuition, perfectly undetermined, proposition, I think. There does not then exist any rational psychology as a doctrine furnishing any addition to our knowledge of ourselves. It is nothing more than a discipline, which sets impassable limits to speculative reason in this region of thought, to prevent it, on the one hand, from throwing itself into the arms of a soulless materialism, and, on the other, from losing itself in the mazes of a baseless spiritualism. It teaches us to consider this refusal of our reason to give any satisfactory answer to questions which reach beyond the limits of this our human life, as a hint to abandon fruitless speculation, and to direct, to a practical use, our knowledge of ourselves, which, although applicable only to objects of experience, receives its principles from a higher source, and regulates its procedure as if our destiny reached far beyond the boundaries of experience and life. From all this it is evident that rational psychology has its origin in a mere misunderstanding. The unity of consciousness, which lies at the basis of the categories, is considered to be an intuition of the subject as an object, and a category of substance is applied to the intuition. But this unity is nothing more than the unity in thought, by which no object is given, to which therefore the category of substance, which always presupposes a given intuition, cannot be applied. Consequently, the subject cannot be cognized.
The subject of the categories cannot, therefore, for the very reason that it cogitates these, frame any conception of itself as an object of the categories. For, to cogitate these, it must lay at the foundation its own pure self-consciousness, the very thing that it wishes to explain and describe.
In like manner, the subject, in which the representation of time has its basis, cannot determine, for this very reason, its own existence in time. Now, if the latter is impossible, the former, as an attempt to determine itself by means of the categories as a thinking being in general, is nullus so. 47. The I think is, as has been already stated, an empirical proposition, and contains the proposition, I exist. But I cannot say, everything which thinks, exists, for in this case the property of thought would constitute all beings possessing it, necessary beings.
Hence my existence cannot be considered as an inference from the proposition, I think, as Descartes maintained, because in this case the major premise, everything, which thinks, exists, must proceed, but the two propositions are identical. The proposition, I think, expresses an undetermined empirical intuition, that perception proving consequently that sensation, which must belong to sensibility, lies at the foundation of this proposition, but it precedes experience, whose province it is to determine an object of perception by means of the categories in relation to time. And existence in this proposition is not a category, as it does not apply to an undetermined given object, but the proposition, I think, expresses an undetermined empirical intuition, that perception proving consequently that sensation, which must belong to sensibility, lies at the foundation of this proposition, but it precedes experience, whose province it is to determine an object of perception by means of the categories in relation to time. And existence in this proposition is not a category, as it does not apply to an undetermined given object, but only to one of which we have a conception, and about which we wish to know whether it does or does not exist, out of, and apart from this conception. Think expresses an undetermined empirical intuition, that perception proving consequently that sensation, which must belong to sensibility, lies at the foundation of this proposition, but it precedes experience, whose province it is to determine an object of perception by means of the categories in relation to time. And existence in this proposition is not a category, as it does not apply to an undetermined given object, but only to one of which we have a conception, and about which we wish to know whether it does or does not exist, out of, and apart from this conception. An undetermined perception signifies here merely something real that has been given, only, however, to thought in general, but not as a phenomenon, nor as a thing in itself noumenon, but only as something that really exists, and is designated as such in the proposition, I think. For it must be remarked that, when I call the proposition, I think, an empirical proposition, I do not thereby mean that the ego in the proposition is an empirical representation. On the contrary, it is purely intellectual, because it belongs to thought in general. But without some empirical representation, which presents to the mind material for thought, the mental act, I think, would not take place, and the empirical is only the condition of the application or employment of the pure intellectual faculty. Thus, then, appears the vanity of the hope of establishing a cognition which is to extend its rule beyond the limits of experience, a cognition which is one of the highest interests of humanity, and thus has proved the futility of the attempt of speculative philosophy in this region of thought.
But, in this interest of thought, the severity of criticism has rendered Torreson a not unimportant service, by the demonstration of the impossibility of making any dogmatical affirmation concerning an object of experience beyond the boundaries of experience. She has thus fortified reason against all affirmations of the contrary. Now, this can be accomplished in only two ways. Either our proposition must be proved apodeictically, or, if this is unsuccessful, the sources of this inability must be sought for, and, if these are discovered to exist in the natural and necessary limitation of our reason, our opponents must submit to the same law of renunciation and refrain from advancing claims to dogmatic assertion.
But the right, say rather the necessity to admit a future life, upon principles of the practical conjoined with the speculative use of reason, has lost nothing by this renunciation, for the merely speculative proof has never had any influence upon the common reason of men. It stands upon the point of a hair, so that even the schools have been able to preserve it from falling only by incessantly discussing it and spinning it like a top. And even in their eyes it has never been able to present any safe foundation for the erection of a theory. The proofs which have been current among men, preserve their value undiminished, nay, rather gain in clearness and unsophisticated power, by the rejection of the dogmatical assumptions of speculative reason. For reason is thus confined within her own peculiar province, the arrangement of ends or aims, which is at the same time the arrangement of nature. and, as a practical faculty, without limiting itself to the latter, it is justified in extending the former, and with it or our existence, beyond the boundaries of experience and life. If we turn our attention to the analogy of the nature of living beings in this world, in the consideration of which reason is obliged to accept as a principle that no organ, no faculty, no appetite is useless, and that nothing is superfluous, nothing disproportionate to its use, nothing unsuited to its end, but that, on the contrary, everything is perfectly conformed to its destination in life, we shall find that man, who alone is the final end and aim of this order, is still the only animal that seems to be accepted from it. For his natural gifts, not merely as regards the talents and motives that may incite him to employ them, but especially the moral law in him, stretch so far beyond all mere earthly utility and advantage, that he feels himself bound to prize the mere consciousness of probity, apart from all advantageous consequences, even the shadowy gift of posthumous fame, above everything, and he is conscious of an inward call to constitute himself, by his conduct in this world, without regard to mere sublunary interests, the citizen of a better. This mighty, irresistible proof, accompanied by an ever-increasing knowledge of the conformability to a purpose in everything we see around us, by the conviction of the boundless immensity of creation, by the consciousness of a certain illimitableness in the possible extension of our knowledge, and by a desire commensurate therewith, remains to humanity, even after the theoretical cognition of ourselves has failed to establish the necessity of an existence after death.
Conclusion of the solution of the psychological paralogism.
The dialectical illusion in rational psychology arises from our confounding an idea of reason, of a pure intelligence with the conception, in every respect undetermined, of a thinking being in general. I cogitate myself in behalf of a possible experience, at the same time making abstraction of all actual experience, and infer therefrom that I can be conscious of myself apart from experience and its empirical conditions. I consequently confound the possible abstraction of my empirically determined existence with the supposed consciousness of a possible separate existence of my thinking self, and I believe that I cognize what is substantial in myself as a transcendental subject, when I have nothing more in thought than the unity of consciousness, which lies at the basis of all determination of cognition. The task of explaining the community of the soul with the body does not properly belong to the psychology of which we are here speaking, because it proposes to prove the personality of the soul apart from this communion after death, and is therefore transcendent in the proper sense of the word, although occupying itself with an object of experience, only in so far, however, as it ceases to be an object of experience.
But a sufficient answer may be found to the question in our system.
The difficulty which lies in the execution of this task consists, as is well known, in the presupposed heterogeneity of the object of the internal sense, the soul, and the objects of the external senses, and as much as the formal condition of the intuition of the one is time, and of that of the other space also. But if we consider that both kinds of objects do not differ internally, but only in so far as the one appears externally to the other, consequently, that what lies at the basis of phenomena, as a thing in itself, may not be heterogeneous, this difficulty disappears. There then remains no other difficulty than is to be found in the question, how a community of substances is possible, a question which lies out of the region of psychology, and which the reader, after what in our analytic has been said of primitive forces and faculties, will easily judge to be also beyond the region of human cognition.
General remark. On the transition from rational psychology to cosmology. The proposition, I think, or I exist thinking, is an empirical proposition.
But such a proposition must be based on empirical intuition, and the object cogitated as a phenomenon, and thus our theory appears to maintain that the soul, even in thought, is merely a phenomenon, and in this way our consciousness itself, in fact, abuts upon nothing. Thought, per se, is merely the purely spontaneous logical function which operates to connect the manifold of a possible intuition, and it does not represent the subject of consciousness as a phenomenon, for this reason alone, that it pays no attention to the question whether the mode of intuiting it is sensuous or intellectual. I therefore do not represent myself in thought either as I am, or as I appear to myself. I merely cogitate myself as an object in general, of the mode of intuiting which I make abstraction.
When I represent myself as the subject of thought, or as the ground of thought, these modes of representation are not related to the categories of substance or of cause, for these are functions of thought applicable only to our sensuous intuition. The application of these categories to the ego would, however, be necessary, if I wished to make myself an object of knowledge.
But I wish to be conscious of myself only as thinking. In what mode myself is given in intuition, I do not consider, and it may be that I, who think, am a phenomenon, although not in so far as I am a thinking being, but in the consciousness of myself in mere thought I am a being, though this consciousness does not present to me any property of this being as material for thought.
But the proposition, I think, in so far as it declares, I exist thinking, is not the mere representation of a logical function.
It determines the subject, which is in this case an object also, in relation to existence, and it cannot be given without the aid of the internal sense, whose intuition presents to us an object, not as a thing in itself, but always as a phenomenon.
In this proposition there is therefore something more to be found than the mere spontaneity of thought. There is also the receptivity of intuition, that is, my thought of myself applied to the empirical intuition of myself.
Now, in this intuition the thinking self must seek the conditions of the employment of its logical functions as categories of substance, cause, and so forth, not merely for the purpose of distinguishing itself as an object in itself by means of the representation, I, but also for the purpose of determining the mode of its existence, that is, of cognizing itself as noumenon. But this is impossible, for the internal empirical intuition is sensuous, and presents us with nothing but phenomenal data, which do not assist the object of pure consciousness in its attempt to cognize itself as a separate existence, but are useful only as contributions to experience. But, let it be granted that we could discover, not in experience, but in certain firmly established a priori laws of the use of pure reason, laws relating to our existence, authority to consider ourselves as legislating a priori in relation to our own existence and as determining this existence, we should, on this supposition, find ourselves possessed of a spontaneity, by which our actual existence would be determinable, without the aid of the conditions of empirical intuition. We should also become aware that in the consciousness of our existence there was an a priori content, which would serve to determine our own existence, an existence only sensuously determinable, relatively, however, to a certain internal faculty in relation to an intelligible world.
But this would not give the least help to the attempts of rational psychology.
For this wonderful faculty, which the consciousness of the moral law in me reveals, would present me with a principle of the determination of my own existence which is purely intellectual, but by what predicates?
By none other than those which are given in sensuous intuition.
Thus I should find myself in the same position in rational psychology which I formerly occupied, that is to say, I should find myself still in need of sensuous intuitions, in order to give significance to my conceptions of substance and cause, by means of which alone I can possess a knowledge of myself, but these intuitions can never raise me above the sphere of experience. I should be justified, however, in applying these conceptions, in regard to their practical use, which is always directed to objects of experience, in conformity with their analogical significance when employed theoretically, to freedom and its subject. At the same time, I should understand by them merely the logical functions of subject and predicate, of principle and consequence, in conformity with which all actions are so determined, that they are capable of being explained along with the laws of nature, conformably to the categories of substance and cause, although they originate from a very different principle.
We have made these observations for the purpose of guarding against misunderstanding, to which the doctrine of our intuition of self as a phenomenon is exposed. We shall have occasion to perceive their utility in the sequel. Chapter 2. The Antinomy of Pure Reason. We showed in the introduction to this part of our work, that all transcendental illusion of pure reason arose from dialectical arguments, the schema of which logic gives us in its three formal species of syllogisms, just as the categories find their logical schema in the four functions of all judgments.
The first kind of these sophistical arguments related to the unconditioned unity of the subjective conditions of all representations in general, of the subject or soul, in correspondence with the categorical syllogisms, the major of which, as the principle, enounces the relation of a predicate to a subject.
The second kind of dialectical argument will therefore be concerned, following the analogy with hypothetical syllogisms, with the unconditioned unity of the objective conditions in the phenomenon, and, in this way, the theme of the third kind to be treated of in the following chapter will be the unconditioned unity of the objective conditions of the possibility of objects in general. But it is worthy of remark that the transcendental paralogism produced in the mind only a one-third illusion, in regard to the idea of the subject of our thought, and the conceptions of reason gave no ground to maintain the contrary proposition.
The advantage is completely on the side of pneumatism, although this theory itself passes into naught, in the crucible of pure reason.
Very different is the case when we apply reason to the objective synthesis of phenomena.
Here, certainly, reason establishes, with much plausibility, its principle of unconditioned unity, but it very soon falls into such contradictions that it is compelled, in relation to cosmology, to renounce its pretensions. For here a new phenomenon of human reason meets us, a perfectly natural antithetic, which does not require to be sought for by subtle sophistry, but into which reason of itself unavoidably falls. It is thereby preserved, to be sure, from the slumber of a fancied conviction, which a merely one-sided illusion produces, but it is at the same time compelled, either, on the one hand, to abandon itself to a despairing skepticism, or, on the other, to assume a dogmatical confidence and obstinate persistence in certain assertions, without granting a fair hearing to the other side of the question.
Either is the death of a sound philosophy, although the former might perhaps deserve the title of the euthanasia of pure reason. Before entering this region of discord and confusion, which the conflict of the laws of pure reason, antinomy, produces, we shall present the reader with some considerations, in explanation and justification of the method we intend to follow in our treatment of this subject.
I term all transcendental ideas, insofar as they relate to the absolute totality in the synthesis of phenomena, cosmical conceptions, partly on account of this unconditioned totality, on which the conception of the world whole is based. A conception, which is itself an idea, partly because they relate solely to the synthesis of phenomena, the empirical synthesis, while, on the other hand, the absolute totality in the synthesis of the conditions of all possible things gives rise to an ideal of pure reason, which is quite distinct from the cosmical conception, although it stands in relation with it.
Hence, as the paralogisms of pure reason laid the foundation for a dialectical psychology, the antinomy of pure reason will present us with the transcendental principles of a pretended pure, rational, cosmology, not, however, to declare it valid and to appropriate it, but, as the very term of a conflict of reason sufficiently indicates, to present it as an idea which cannot be reconciled with phenomena and experience. Section I: System of Cosmological Ideas. That we may be able to enumerate with systematic precision these ideas according to a principle, we must remark, in the first place, that it is from the understanding alone that pure and transcendental conceptions take their origin. That the reason does not properly give birth to any conception, but only frees the conception of the understanding from the unavoidable limitation of the possible experience, and thus endeavors to raise it above the empirical, though it must still be in connection with it.
This happens from the fact that, for a given condition, reason demands absolute totality on the side of the conditions to which the understanding submits all phenomena, and thus makes of the category a transcendental idea. This it does that it may be able to give absolute completeness to the empirical synthesis, by continuing it to the unconditioned, which is not to be found in experience, but only in the idea. Reason requires this according to the principle: if the conditioned is given, the whole of the conditions, and consequently the absolutely unconditioned, is also given, whereby alone the former was possible.
First, then, the transcendental ideas are properly nothing but categories elevated to the unconditioned, and they may be arranged in a table according to the titles of the latter.
But, secondly, all the categories are not available for this purpose, but only those in which the synthesis constitutes a series of conditions subordinated to, not coordinated with, each other. Absolute totality is required of reason only in so far as concerns the ascending series of the conditions of a conditioned, not, consequently, when the question relates to the descending series of consequences, or to the aggregate of the coordinated conditions of these consequences.
For, in relation to a given condition, conditions are presupposed and considered to be given along with it.
On the other hand, as the consequences do not render possible their conditions, but rather presuppose them, in the consideration of the procession of consequences, or in the descent from the given condition to the conditioned, we may be quite unconcerned whether the series ceases or not, and their totality is not a necessary demand of reason.
Thus we cogitate, and necessarily, a given time completely elapsed up to a given moment, although that time is not determinable by us.
But as regards time future, which is not the condition of arriving at the present, in order to conceive it, it is quite indifferent whether we consider future time as ceasing at some point, or as prolonging itself to infinity.
Take, for example, the series m, n, o, in which n is given as conditioned in relation to m, but at the same time as the condition of o, and let the series proceed upwards from the conditioned n to m, l, k, I, etc., and also downwards from the condition n to the condition o, p, q, r, etc.
I must presuppose the former series, to be able to consider n as given, and n is according to reason, the totality of conditions possible only by means of that series.
But its possibility does not rest on the following series o, p, q, r, which for this reason cannot be regarded as given, but only as capable of being given, debilis.
I shall term the synthesis of the series on the side of the conditions, from that nearest to the given phenomenon up to the more remote, regressive, that which proceeds on the side of the conditioned, from the immediate consequence to the more remote, I shall call the progressive synthesis.
The former proceeds in antecedentia, the latter in consequentia. The cosmological ideas are therefore occupied with the totality of the regressive synthesis, and proceed in antecedentia, not in consequentia.
When the latter takes place, it is an arbitrary and not a necessary problem of pure reason, for we require, for the complete understanding of what is given in a phenomenon, not the consequences which succeed, but the grounds or principles which precede.
In order to construct the table of ideas in correspondence with the table of categories, we take first the two primitive quanta of all our intuitions, time and space.
Time is in itself a series, and the formal condition of all series, and hence, in relation to a given present, we must distinguish a priori in it the antecedentia as conditions, time past, from the consequentia, time future.
Consequently, the transcendental idea of the absolute totality of the series of the conditions of a given condition relates merely to all past time. According to the idea of reason, the whole past time, as the condition of the given moment, is necessarily cogitated as given.
But, as regards space, there exists in it no distinction between progressus and regressus, for it is an aggregate and not a series, its parts existing together at the same time. I can consider a given point of time in relation to past time only as conditioned, because this given moment comes into existence only through the past time rather through the passing of the preceding time. But as the parts of space are not subordinated, but coordinated to each other, one part cannot be the condition of the possibility of the other, and space is not in itself, like time, a series.
But the synthesis of the manifold parts of space, the syntheses whereby we apprehend space, is nevertheless successive. It takes place, therefore, in time, and contains a series.
And as in this series of aggregated spaces, for example, the feet in a root beginning with a given portion of space, those which continue to be annexed form the condition of the limits of the former. The measurement of a space must also be regarded as a synthesis of the series of the conditions of a given conditioned. It differs, however, in this respect from that of time, that the side of the conditioned is not in itself distinguishable from the side of the condition, and, consequently, regressus and progressus in space seem to be identical.
But, inasmuch as one part of space is not given, but only limited, by and through another, we must also consider every limited space as conditioned, insofar as it presupposes some other space as the condition of its limitation, and so on.
As regards limitation, therefore, our procedure in space is also a regressus, and the transcendental idea of the absolute totality of the synthesis in a series of conditions applies to space also, and I am entitled to demand the absolute totality of the phenomenal synthesis in space as well as in time.
Whether my demand can be satisfied is a question to be answered in the sequel. Secondly, the real in space, that is matter, is conditioned.
Its internal conditions are its parts, and the parts of parts its remote conditions, so that in this case we find a regressive synthesis, the absolute totality of which is a demand of reason.
But this cannot be obtained otherwise than by a complete division of parts, whereby the real in matter becomes either nothing or that which is not matter, that is to say, the simple. Consequently, we find here also a series of conditions and a progress to the unconditioned.
Thirdly, as regards the categories of a real relation between phenomena, the category of substance and its accidents is not suitable for the formation of a transcendental idea. That is to say, reason has no ground, in regard to it, to proceed regressively with conditions.
For accidents, in so far as they inhere in a substance, are coordinated with each other and do not constitute a series. And, in relation to substance, they are not properly subordinated to it, but are the mode of existence of the substance itself. The conception of the substantial might nevertheless seem to be an idea of the transcendental reason. But, as this signifies nothing more than the conception of an object in general, which subsists in so far as we cogitate in it merely a transcendental subject without any predicates, and as the question here is of an unconditioned in the series of phenomena, it is clear that the substantial can form no member thereof. The same holds good of substances in community, which are mere aggregates and do not form a series. For they are not subordinated to each other as conditions of the possibility of each other, which, however, may be affirmed of spaces, the limits of which are never determined in themselves, but always by some other space.
It is, therefore, only in the category of causality that we can find a series of causes to a given effect, and in which we ascend from the latter, as the conditioned, to the former as the conditions, and thus answer the question of reason. Fourthly, the conceptions of the possible, the actual, and the necessary do not conduct us to any series, excepting only in so far as the contingent in existence must always be regarded as conditioned, and as indicating, according to a law of the understanding, a condition, under which it is necessary to rise to a higher, till in the totality of the series, reason arrives at unconditioned necessity. There are, accordingly, only 4 cosmological ideas, corresponding with the 4 titles of the categories.
For we can select only such as necessarily furnish us with a series in the synthesis of the manifold. For we can select only such as necessarily furnish us with a series in the synthesis of the manifold. 1. The absolute completeness of the composition of the given totality of all phenomena. 2. The absolute completeness of the division of given totality in a phenomenon. 3. The absolute completeness of the origination of a phenomenon. 4. The absolute completeness of the dependence of the existence of what is changeable in a phenomenon.
We must here remark, in the first place, that the idea of absolute totality relates to nothing but the exposition of phenomena, and therefore not to the pure conception of a totality of things. Phenomena are here, therefore, regarded as given, and reason requires the absolute completeness of the conditions of their possibility, insofar as these conditions constitute a series, consequently and absolutely, that is, in every respect complete synthesis, whereby a phenomenon can be explained according to the laws of the understanding.
Secondly, it is properly the unconditioned alone that reason seeks in this serially and regressively conducted synthesis of conditions. It wishes, to speak in another way, to attain to completeness in the series of premises, so as to render it unnecessary to presuppose others. This unconditioned is always contained in the absolute totality of the series, when we endeavor to form a representation of it in thought. But this absolutely complete synthesis is itself but an idea, for it is impossible, at least beforehand, to know whether any such synthesis is possible in the case of phenomena.
When we represent all existence in thought by means of pure conceptions of the understanding, without any conditions of sensuous intuition, we may say with justice that for a given condition the whole series of conditions subordinated to each other is also given, for the former is only given through the latter.
But we find in the case of phenomena a particular limitation of the mode in which conditions are given, that is, through the successive synthesis of the manifold of intuition, which must be complete in the regress. Now whether this completeness is sensuously possible is a problem. But the idea of it lies in the reason, be it possible or impossible to connect with the idea adequate empirical conceptions.
Therefore, as in the absolute totality of the regressive synthesis of the manifold in a phenomenon following the guidance of the categories, which represent it as a series of conditions to a given condition, the unconditioned is necessarily contained, it being still left unascertained whether and how this totality exists, reason sets out from the idea of totality, although its proper and final aim is the unconditioned, of the whole series, or of a part thereof. This unconditioned may be cogitated, either as existing only in the entire series, all the members of which therefore would be without exception conditioned and only the totality absolutely unconditioned, and in this case the regressus is called infinite, or the absolutely unconditioned is only a part of the series, to which the other members are subordinated, but which is not itself submitted to any other condition.
In the former case the series is a part a priori unlimited, without beginning, that is, infinite, and nevertheless completely given. But the regress in it is never completed, and can only be called potentially infinite. In the second case there exists a first in the series. This first is called, in relation to past time, the beginning of the world, in relation to space, the limit of the world, in relation to the parts of a given limited whole, the simple, in relation to causes, absolute spontaneity, liberty, and in relation to the existence of changeable things, absolute physical necessity. 48. The absolute totality of the series of conditions to a given condition is always unconditioned, because beyond it there exist no other conditions, on which it might depend. But the absolute totality of such a series is only an idea, or rather a problematical conception, the possibility of which must be investigated, particularly in relation to the mode in which the unconditioned, as the transcendental idea which is the real subject of inquiry, may be contained therein. We possess two expressions, world and nature, which are generally interchanged.
The first denotes the mathematical total of all phenomena and the totality of their synthesis, in its progress by means of composition, as well as by division.
And the world is termed nature. When it is regarded as a dynamical whole, when our attention is not directed to the aggregation in space and time, for the purpose of cogitating it as a quantity, but to the unity in the existence of phenomena.
In this case the condition of that which happens is called a cause, the unconditioned causality of the cause in a phenomenon is termed liberty, the conditioned cause is called in a more limited sense a natural cause.
The conditioned in existence is termed contingent, and the unconditioned necessary.
The unconditioned necessity of phenomena may be called natural necessity. 49. Nature, understood adjective formaliter, signifies the complex of the determinations of a thing, connected according to an internal principle of causality. On the other hand, we understand by nature, substantive materialiter, the sum total of phenomena, insofar as they, by virtue of an internal principle of causality, are connected with each other throughout.
In the former sense we speak of the nature of liquid matter, of fire, etc., and employ the word only adjective, while, if speaking of the objects of nature, we have in our minds the idea of a subsisting whole.
The ideas which we are at present engaged in discussing I have called cosmological ideas, partly because by the term world is understood the entire content of all phenomena, and our ideas are directed solely to the unconditioned among phenomena, partly also, because world, in the transcendental sense, signifies the absolute totality of the content of existing things, and we are directing our attention only to the completeness of the synthesis, although, properly, only in regression. In regard to the fact that these ideas are all transcendent, and, although they do not transcend phenomena as regards their mode, but are concerned solely with the world of sense, and not with noumena, nevertheless carry their synthesis to a degree far above all possible experience, it still seems to me that we can, with perfect propriety, designate them cosmical conceptions.
As regards the distinction between the mathematically and the dynamically unconditioned, which is the aim of the regression of the synthesis, I should call the two former, in a more limited signification, cosmical conceptions, the remaining two transcendent physical conceptions. This distinction does not at present seem to be of particular importance, but we shall afterwards find it to be of some value. Section 2. Antithetic of pure reason. Thetic is the term applied to every collection of dogmatical propositions.
By antithetic, I do not understand dogmatical assertions of the opposite, but the self-contradiction of seemingly dogmatical cognitions, thesis cum antithesis, in none of which we can discover any decided superiority.
Antithetic is not, therefore, occupied with one-sided statements, but is engaged in considering the contradictory nature of the general cognitions of reason and its causes. Transcendental antithetic is an investigation into the antinomy of pure reason, its causes and result.
If we employ our reason not merely in the application of the principles of the understanding to objects of experience, but venture with it beyond these boundaries, there arise certain sophistical propositions or theorems. These assertions have the following peculiarities. They can find neither confirmation nor confutation in experience, and each is in itself not only self-consistent, but possesses conditions of its necessity in the very nature of reason, only that, unluckily, there exist just as valid and necessary grounds for maintaining the contrary proposition.
The questions which naturally arise in the consideration of this dialectic of pure reason are therefore, first, in what propositions is pure reason unavoidably subject to an antinomy? Second, what are the causes of this antinomy? Third, whether and in what way can reason free itself from this self-contradiction?
A dialectical proposition or theorem of pure reason must, according to what has been said, be distinguishable from all sophistical propositions, by the fact that it is not an answer to an arbitrary question, which may be raised at the mere pleasure of any person, but to one which human reason must necessarily encounter in its progress. In the second place, a dialectical proposition, with its opposite, does not carry the appearance of a merely artificial illusion, which disappears as soon as it is investigated, but a natural and unavoidable illusion, which, even when we are no longer deceived by it, continues to mock us and, although rendered harmless, can never be completely removed.
This dialectical doctrine will not relate to the unity of understanding in empirical conceptions, but to the unity of reason in pure ideas. The conditions of this doctrine are, inasmuch as it must, as a synthesis according to rules, be conformable to the understanding, and at the same time as the absolute unity of the synthesis, to the reason, that, if it is adequate to the unity of reason, it is too great for the understanding, if according with the understanding, it is too small for the reason. Hence arises a mutual opposition, which cannot be avoided, do what we will. These sophistical assertions of dialectic open, as it were, a battlefield, where that side obtains the victory which has been permitted to make the attack, and he is compelled to yield who has been unfortunately obliged to stand on the defensive. And hence, champions of ability, whether on the right or on the wrong side, are certain to carry away the crown of victory, if they only take care to have the right to make the last attack, and are not obliged to sustain another onset from their opponent. We can easily believe that this arena has been often trampled by the feet of combatants, that many victories have been obtained on both sides, but that the last victory, decisive of the affair between the contending parties, was won by him who fought for the right, only if his adversary was forbidden to continue the tourney. As impartial umpires, we must lay aside entirely the consideration whether the combatants are fighting for the right or for the wrong side, for the true or for the false, and allow the combat to be first decided. Perhaps after they have wearied more than injured each other, they will discover the nothingness of their cause of quarrel and part good friends. This method of watching, or rather of originating, a conflict of assertions, not for the purpose of finally deciding in favor of either side, but to discover whether the object of the struggle is not a mere illusion, which each strives in vain to reach, but which would be no gain even when reached, this procedure, I say, may be termed the skeptical method.
It is thoroughly distinct from skepticism, the principle of a technical and scientific ignorance, which undermines the foundations of all knowledge, in order, if possible, to destroy our belief and confidence therein. For the skeptical method aims at certainty, by endeavoring to discover in a conflict of this kind, conducted honestly and intelligently on both sides, the point of misunderstanding, just as wise legislators derive, from the embarrassment of judges in lawsuits, information in regard to the defective and ill-defined parts of their statutes.
The antinomy which reveals itself in the application of laws, is for our limited wisdom the best criterion of legislation. For the attention of reason, which in abstract speculation does not easily become conscious of its errors, is thus roused to the momenta in the determination of its principles. But this skeptical method is essentially peculiar to transcendental philosophy, and can perhaps be dispensed with in every other field of investigation.
In mathematics its use would be absurd, because in it no false assertions can long remain hidden, inasmuch as its demonstrations must always proceed under the guidance of pure intuition, and by means of an always evident synthesis. In experimental philosophy, doubt and delay may be very useful, but no misunderstanding is possible, which cannot be easily removed, and in experience means of solving the difficulty and putting an end to the dissension must at last be found, whether sooner or later. Moral philosophy can always exhibit its principles, with their practical consequences, in concreto, at least in possible experiences, and thus escape the mistakes and ambiguities of abstraction. But transcendental propositions, which lay claim to insight beyond the region of possible experience, cannot, on the one hand, exhibit their abstract synthesis in any a priori intuition, nor, on the other, expose a lurking error by the help of experience. Transcendental reason, therefore, presents us with no other criterion than that of an attempt to reconcile such assertions, and for this purpose to permit a free and unrestrained conflict between them.
And this we now proceed to arrange. 50. The antinomies stand in the order of the four transcendental ideas above detailed. First conflict of the transcendental ideas, thesis. The world has a beginning in time, and is also limited in regard to space. Proof.
Granted that the world has no beginning in time, up to every given moment of time, an eternity must have elapsed, and therewith passed away an infinite series of successive conditions or states of things in the world.
Now the infinity of a series consists in the fact that it never can be completed by means of a successive synthesis. It follows that an infinite series already elapsed is impossible and that, consequently, a beginning of the world is a necessary condition of its existence. And this was the first thing to be proved. As regards the second, let us take the opposite for granted. In this case, the world must be an infinite given total of coexistent things. Now we cannot cogitate the dimensions of a quantity, which is not given within certain limits of an intuition,
in any other way than by means of the synthesis of its parts, and the total of such a quantity only by means of a completed synthesis, or the repeated addition of unity to itself. Accordingly,